them had placed their trust in God. Here, the Apostle Paul was on board this ship, a ship that was destined, I think, to go to Rome, loaded to capacity with all kinds of people, pagans, idol worshippers, people who knew not God, caught in the midst of a storm. And it seemed apparent to them that their lives would be lost because that ship was going down. And here,
We lost the feed. Yeah, Pastor dropped off. Should be in the lower left corner, Elder Joe. I'll put it on the screen. I'll ask you to unmute. Okay, you see that? On the screen?
Okay,
There you go.
okay, Pastor. It's already done.
Should be in the lower left corner, Elder Joe.
Can you hear me? Montel, can you hear me?
I'll put it on the screen. I'll ask you to unmute. Yes, you're
Okay,
coming
see
through
that?
loud and clear.
It's on mute, okay,
screen?
okay,
There you go.
okay. Pastor,
Unmute Tony's computer. The host is not unmuting him. He is on, but the more.
no, but here he's on mute.
Yes, it's on the screen. I'll ask you to.
So you can't unmute his computer, right? Tony, he can't unmute you. You go to that.
I can't unmute
No, but
anyone.
here he's on mute.
I can't unmute anyone. You have to unmute yourself. Yes, it's on the screen.
Okay, now.
All right, folks, I'm awfully sorry about that. I would prefer to be in my own office and sit to the desk, but a thing came across the screen, and I thought I would try to remove it while I was speaking, and it just knocked me off completely, and I just don't seem to be able to. I'm on, but
It's working. I'm going to turn it up. It's working.
is it unmuted up there?
Yeah, you're
Yes,
good
well, let me
now.
go back out here. Just bear with me for a minute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm in his lab now.
All right, Montel, thank you.
No problem.
Like I said, this thing flashed across the screen, and I figured I wanted to just erase it. And when I tried to do that, it knocked me off completely. All right. Let me try to regain my composure. As I was saying that being at sea in a violent storm is one of the most fearful experiences you can have. I don't care whether you're a good swimmer or not. As I remember as a boy traveling from St. Kitts to Nevis, that was the means of commuting between both islands. And I will never forget one night, the ship was caught in a storm, the ferry. The captain was an old sea captain from St. Bart's, I believe, a very experienced man. But when he got to the channel, he felt that he could not control the ship any longer. So he called for his skipper, a younger man. He had no government credentials. The captain had that. But the captain was humble enough and called the skipper to take charge of the helm, and brought the boat safely to harbor. The Apostle Paul happened to be on board a ship. According to the description of the size of the ship, it was a pretty large vessel. Doesn't matter that it wasn't like one of the ocean liners that we see today. No. But it was capable of making voyages between the different countries. And here in the midst of this storm, men and women are screaming for their lives. And the Apostle Paul could stand up and say to the crowd of the people, the passengers of all different backgrounds and persuasion. He said, have no fear. What do you mean, have no fear? Have no fear. I believe God. He didn't preach a sermon, but in a sense, it was a sermon. Have no fear. I believe God. Wherefore, sirs, be of good courage, for I believe God. Things will turn out even as he told me. These people don't know what Paul is talking about. Who is he talking about? And Paul knew that they didn't know. But he stood up boldly because an angel had visited Paul and told him, Paul, not to worry. No matter how bad the storm got, no one would lose their lives. They didn't know that, but he got the message. And he stood up boldly and told them, have no fear. I believe God. Things will turn out even as he told me. Now, let me tell you this. The presence of a brave and confident man in the midst of a storm, his ability to create calm and comfort in their great fear. When there is commotion, people seem to have no sense of direction. They're confused and they don't know what to do. The truth is, none of them could have done anything. They're passengers, they're crew members. Everything is out of control. But one man in the midst was able to stand up and say, have no fear. Sometimes in the commotion of life, it takes one person with courage, just to be able to talk cheerfully and encouragingly to people. Here is the Apostle Paul talking to the crew and to the guards that were guarding the prisoners and to the prisoners. You must have seen or read how one person of courage is able to change the course of events in which they find themselves. For example, Martin Luther, whom we have studied, changed the course of Christianity by taking the bold step to defy the papacy and enlightened the poor people who were deprived of the truth of the gospel, even at the peril of his life. Then we think of Winston Churchill, the great English statesman, who gave the Brits, people of Britain, courage under a fierce bombing from Germany in World War II and rallied his people to victory. It took one man who was able to bring courage and calm and confidence to stand up bravely. There is Martin Luther King, because of his nonviolence approach, was able to maintain a calm that worked tactfully during the civil rights era. And I want to tell you about a lady who was a Catholic nun. Mother Teresa, as she was called. Mother Teresa dedicated her life to helping the unfortunate, especially in India. One heroic person, be it a man or a woman, can lift the spirits of those trapped in a fearful and hopeless condition. Dear Christian man or woman, wherever you are stationed in life, you ought to be the one of courage, the one of spirit, because your God is your shelter in the time of storm. Your confidence in God will help to strengthen the weak and bring hope to the hopeless. To be effective in the sick chamber, where pain and suffering exist, in the midst of all the troubles of life, you must be strong and confident yourself. Remember, nothing can come out of you that is not in you. Now, the reason that Paul was able to embolden his companions is because of his connection with God. He was confident in what God said. It didn't matter how the ship rocked and rolled and creaked, and it seemed as if it would split apart. He was confident of one thing, confident of what God had said. For God said to Paul that not one life would be lost in that terrible storm, even if that ship broke into pieces. What faith it must have taken to believe that. Even a message from God in that circumstance. How easily or how difficult it is to believe such a message from God. But Paul, the Apostle Paul, the same one who persecuted Christians, the same one who was in hunt for Christians to put them in prison because they were serving the God of heaven. When Paul got thrown from his horse and his eyes were open and his spiritual strength and eyes took hold of him, Paul began to run with the gospel. Here is Paul in the midst of a storm, surrounded by, I don't know how many hundreds of people on board that vessel. A vessel that is destined to be destroyed. And he could stand up boldly without fear, without trembling, without muttering, and said, "Have no fear. I believe God." I wanted to ask you, what level of faith is required to be content with such a promise? What level of faith? Is there some measurement, some degree of faith? The Bible said if you had as much faith as a mustard seed. He tells me that Paul had the faith of a mustard seed, probably even greater than a mustard seed. For in a circumstance like that, to be able to stand up boldly and say, "Have no fear. I believe God." And to share it boldly with the people who did not even believe in God. People who saw their lives about to be taken away by this storm. I want to tell you, no matter how violent and how controllable the situation you find yourself, if you have a connection with God, you have nothing to fear. Was I fearful with this storm, as I said before? Not really. Not really. My God is always in control. I am not naive to think that I will not have to encounter problems, but I know that my God is in control. You and I should not be fearful. Yes, we have our emotions. And yes, there are things that cause us to fear. But as we see the hand of God moving in our lives, moving in the lives of individuals who suffer adversely, through surgeries, through all kinds of situations, and God is gracious, and God is able, and He brings us through. We have living witnesses among us who have experienced the powerful healing, protecting, and providing hands of the God that we serve. In a situation like that, Paul finds himself in the midst of prisoners, men of all kinds of strange beliefs and practices, who didn't even believe in God. Perhaps some of his traveling companions may have believed like him. But the others, they might have pulled out their little useless idols, no matter how turbulent and threatening it seemed, while they were fearful for their lives. But Paul was steadfast and confident. Fear not, Paul, for I have given them in your hands. What a promise. What a command. My ship is about to be broken up in pieces. And he remained steadfast because he believed God's promise. And all he had to do is to wait to see the fulfillment of that promise. Even though the ship was getting ready to go down. What kind of faith does that take? Do you and I have that faith? This is something that we have to work on. We've got to work on it. But even though we think we have that faith, when we come to that moment, when there is no other way out, that we will put our faith and our trust and our confidence in our God. Paul's faith was in God, not in some piece of funny, lifeless looking object. Paul believed God. There is a difference between saying, I believe in God, and to say, I believe God. Did you get that? There is a difference in saying, I believe in God. Do you know when you talk to people about the Word of God, and you talk to them about different phases of Christianity, the common response is most times is, I believe in God. Even if they're not going to church, even if they're not church people, they'll say, I believe in God. And that is supposed to settle the score, so to speak. But then, when you observe their lives, they say they believe in God, but they don't believe God. For if they believed God, they would do the things that God said. And the things that create the great division in Christianity is that command that says remember. But if you believe God, you would obey that remember. If you can't, if you find it impossible or difficult or whatever, to honor that command, you really don't believe God. You say you believe in God? Well, maybe you believe that He does exist, but you don't believe in obeying what He says. Paul, on the other hand, said, at a moment like that, when it seemed like everything would be lost, lives, Paul didn't get up and say, I believe in God. He said, men and women, have no fear. I believe God. This is what he has said. Not one of you will lose your life. A ship that is about to go down. He had the courage to stand up and say that. You know, even a preacher, some preachers, in circumstances like that, wouldn't have the courage and the faith to stand up and say, men and women have no fear. I believe God. Some of them would panic just like the others. Men who profess to be God's mouthpiece among individuals who have no sense of direction for their lives. In the midst of turmoil and difficulty, they lose courage and they run for cover. Rather than being able to stand up and say, men and women have no fear. Everything will turn out according to what God says. Paul wasn't relying on some trinkets and some little idols that people carry around with them. Paul believed in the God of heaven, and he listens to the God of heaven, and he has the courage. Paul was confident that if God promised it, he was able to perform it. It didn't matter how the winds howled, how the ship bounced up and down like a slab of cork upon the ocean. Paul clung to that promise. He was confident that not even one hair of the man's head would be harmed. God had given him that solemn promise. And regardless to how boisterous and threatening it all seemed, Paul clung to God's promise. It reminded me of the attitude of the Moravians when the Pilgrims decided to cross the Atlantic in search of religious freedom. The voyage wasn't a piece of cake. There were times when it seemed that the ship would capsize. And while the other religious sects were fearful for their lives, history says that the Moravians were peacefully singing songs of hope and the joy in Jesus, who would bring them to safe harbor. Well, can you hear me? What is this? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, yes.
Okay, because something funny just happened here and I thought everything was lost. It is when the storms of life are raging that we must hold on to God's unchanging hand. Paul was at peace. He was able to console the captain, the crew, his fellow passengers, and all who was on that ship. They felt that they were without hope, but Paul was able to breathe hope and confidence. He simply said, I believe God. It is not easy to say that when you see yourself overwhelmed by the circumstances of life. We must be prepared to trust God in good times and in difficult times. It is truly a grand thing to believe God when the waves howl like a pack of wild beasts ready to devour you, to say, I believe God, and truly believe God. It can give you courage to face the fiercest tempest. I believe God is something more than saying I believe in God. When we say I believe God, we believe his truthfulness, believe his spoken word, believe his mercy and his power, not just to pacify God, but by saying we believe in God. No, no, no. He does not need to be pacified. I believe God means that we believe it regardless of what we encounter in this life. I believe God. Paul gave comfort. It gave him peace. It gave him a calm spirit and the assurance that God would fulfill his promise. Oh, that professed Christians could with deep conviction say, I believe God, and truly believe it. If God says it, even if the ship seems to be going under, believe his word. If he says he will bring it to pass. The common run of men's faith is fair weather faith. There's a big difference between fair weather faith. The faith of God's elect is the faith that can see in the dark. Let me repeat that. The faith of God's elect is a faith that can see in the dark. The faith that is calm in turmoil. The faith that can sing in the midst of sorrow. The faith that is brightest when everything around us is as black as midnight. The psalmist David said, my soul, wait thou only upon God, for my expectation is from him. Psalms 46, verses 1 to 3. Now I know that it's not always easy to thrust out your faith, especially when people return to their homes after this Hurricane Ian and see only ruins and unrepairable structures. In other words, no home is left. One reporter said, to see only a slab of concrete where their houses once stood. We cannot relate to that. But when you look at the pictures that they show, the scenes, oh my Father, I feel it in my stomach. I cannot imagine what it would be like going back in search for what you think was your home and find only a slab of cement. What kind of faith it would take to say the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Nothing that's salvageable. Everything is gone and no way to turn. It is at times like this that the devil causes faith to be dumb. At times like this when we are about against our biggest temptation, Satan works the hardest. And God is robbed of his honor. Genuine faith in God speaks out and says, God is real. God is truth. And I am willing to stake everything on his word. When the time comes and others are in difficulties and doubts, he cheers them by declaring, I believe God. I wish that all Christians were prepared to throw down the gauntlet and come out straight and be not afraid to say, I believe God. If God's promises are true, why should we distrust them? What excuse is there to hesitate? Some may see it as being risky. I ask you, risks? Risks with God? Risks about God keeping his word? It cannot be. The Bible says, let God be true and every man a liar. Romans chapter 3, verse 4. Heaven and earth may pass away, but the Most High God cannot break his word or renege on his promise. So you who think you love Christ, but are timid to speak it or to share your conviction, think of Paul and a loaded ship with all types of people, pagans, skeptics, agnostics, non-believers, all in peril of their lives. Yet Paul, a servant of the Most High God, could boldly declare that no matter how rough the journey, no matter how threatening things appear, there is hope in Jesus. There is deliverance in Jesus. There is peace in Jesus. There is life, life everlasting in Jesus. It would be nice to have a little cute buttons pinned upon our lapels saying, I believe Jesus. My brothers and my sisters, this morning, one other example of how God can deliver in all circumstances of life. God is able. We don't often think about those things in our own troubles because we are concerned about our own lives. But if we can just stop for a moment when we are facing some of the most terrible experience in life and say, I believe God because I know he is able. I trust that somewhere along the line, we can develop that trust and confidence in God. We will see the difference in our lives and our influence in the lives of others. May God bless us. May God keep us and continue to use us as his ambassadors among men and women until he comes. God bless. All right.
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
We're gonna sing
Our
a song.
closing song is hymn number, what did I do with it?
545.